Welcome to the FinTech One-on-One podcast. This is Peter Renton, co-founder of FinTech Nexus and now the CEO of the FinTech consulting company Renton & Co. I've been doing this show since 2013, which makes this the longest running one-on-one interview show in all of FinTech. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. Now let's get on with the show. Today on the show, I am delighted to welcome Rodger Desai. He is the CEO and founder of Prove. Now, Prove is a super interesting company. They are one of the world leaders in ID verification and authentication. I wanted to get Rodger on the show because this is such a fast-moving area. There's so much happening, particularly when it comes to generative AI. We cover a lot of territory on this episode. We discuss ID verification best practices, embedded authentication. We talk about the bad guys. What are the implications of some of this Gen AI powered fraud being used today? We talk about the different attack vectors criminals are using. We talk about digital trust and much more. It was a fascinating discussion. Hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to the podcast, Rodger.
Thank you, Peter. Good to be here.
Okay, my pleasure. So let's kick it off by giving the listeners a little bit of background about yourself. I know you've been doing Prove for a long time, over a decade now, but tell us a little bit about your career to date, particularly before Prove.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And great to be here. I've always been very entrepreneurial. I had a company a long time ago that helped with micro lending. Back then, it was difficult to know what kinds of projects folks could take on with a microloan in developing countries. And one of the winning solutions was to give people a cell phone so they could rent it out to other villagers. And these villages with no electricity and certainly no cell phone towers. We somehow magically made it work. But I saw firsthand the societal impacts of giving people a phone. And ever since then, I've been looking at other ways to use a phone besides the way it kind of keeps us connected to our friends and family. But as a tool that can keep us safe, that can connect us to the world, help us thrive in the digital economy.
All right. What led to Prove then? What was sort of the idea that specifically you wanted to really explore there?
Prove was originally called Payphone. And one thing I noticed in the phone world is quite more advanced than we give it credit for, definitely more advanced than the web itself.
Right.
So think about going on a European vacation and the phone just works wherever you go. Despite, let's say if you had AT&T or Verizon, those companies don't exist outside the US, yet your phone works and it's convenient, secure, private, all at the same time without trade-offs. So the original use case was to make it so that you could essentially use your airtime to pay for things. Most of the world at the time, and even now, doesn't have a credit or debit card. So even in Italy where we launched, I think only 8% of Italians had a way to buy an iTunes. And so we made it so that you could just burn off exactly the amount of airtime in order to buy an iTunes, for example. The key insight there was that we knew whose airtime to burn without having to ask the person. And that's because the SIM card acts as your proxy. So today, Prove does a lot of things around authentication. We can know it's Peter without having to ask, if it's you or who you are. Of course, when you ask someone who they are, they could say there's someone else. So one of the novel things we figured out in the early days was, there's things like SIM cards act as a great proxy for someone's identity.
Okay. Why did you decide to focus on financial services? What was the thinking there?
It was, after talking to lots of customers, they said, well, this is great that you can make it so that you can convert the roaming system into a payment system, which is, phenomenal. But that's a limited part of the market, just digital goods. When we spoke to banks, they're like, listen, the challenging part is not the underwriting part. Like we're banks, we're good at underwriting. We just can't figure out who anyone is online without asking them a lot of questions that quite annoy them. And so they love the fact that we could passively identify folks, with their consent, of course, by a very, very frictionless measure. And that could apply to anything. It could apply not just to buying something, but logging into an account, like high-risk transactions, account opening, pretty much the entire digital journey, not just the ability to buy a digital good.
Okay, interesting. So then what does Prove actually provide today? Just talk about the different types of services that you're offering.
So the first thing we looked at is what kind of asset can we build that can help enable these amazing experiences, making things that are easy to use but yet more secure at the same time. Which typically those things are trade-offs. You can have things that are convenient but not secure, and vice versa. So we created a platform to drive our many solutions. But we create something called an identity token, and what that is your identity tied to something we can authenticate, like a SIM key, a pass key, things like that. So, for example, if you wanted to open up a bank account as a consumer, what if you could just type in your phone number, get a text with a link, click on the link, which authenticates your SIM card, and that is your entire application. So it's convenient because it's just a few pieces of data. It's more secure because the only way I can pretend to be Peter Renton is if I have his phone in my hand during the transaction. With Prove, we can make it so you can apply for things with just your phone and phone number, because behind the scenes, we know who owns and operates nearly every phone.
But that doesn't happen very much. I mean, most of the time, from what I can gather, you might do that authentication, but there's also other things, particularly if you're applying for a loan or something that with a high ticket value, that there is other parts to the process, right?
Yeah, I kind of simplified it. Yes, it's almost like if you think of like, let's say you went to Sicily for vacation and you made phone calls there. A lot more is happening behind the scenes besides authenticating your phone. They have to know how to bill you in that currency. They're underwriting you effectively in real time. So we do all the same thing. So, for example, when you click on that link that's sent to you, we authenticate that SIM card. We have a bind between that SIM and, let's say, your national ID. And because we have now your national ID, we can then fetch things about you with your permission. I can fetch your name, your address, your date of birth, things like your income, your credit score. We can fetch those things from partners we have because we don't store that kind of information with a simple consent and authentication from the consumer. So, in other words, we can get all the data required for incredibly complex tasks like underwriting by making it as simple as clicking on a link. That's because of the authentication behind the scenes and our ability to fetch things with your consent.
Okay. Okay, so let's just take a step back for a second and talk about ID verification best practices. I mean, beyond just the Prove product, if there's banks and fintech companies listening, what are some of the best practices that you would recommend for someone who wants to up their game when it comes to ID verification?
I think the original assumptions we've had just don't work anymore. I think it was thought when like things like CIP in the US were developed after 9/11, it was thought that, well, in order to open a bank account, you need to know the person's name, address, social security number, date of birth, and those things need to go together in authoritative databases. I think at the time it was considered impossible or really expensive to be able to get someone else's personal information. Like, how would I know where Peter lives and his birthday? Like that's
Mhm.
hard to determine because of all the breaches that have taken place. It's very, very readily available and very cheap. And so I can go to a bank in St. Peter, put in that information. The bank will then see if that data goes together, and it will because I got it from a breach. And then effectively, I pose as Peter at that point.
Mhm.
So the part that's missing that we've been advocating to regulators, to banks, the community in general is adding authentication. So it's one thing to verify information that you're provided by the consumer, but how do you authenticate that there's some kind of cryptographic key that's present that you can authenticate? So, for example, if you know that this is Peter's phone that's behind the transaction, that is a higher bar than just knowing things about Peter. And so the combination of verifying that data, but also saying, hey, Peter's phone was present and authenticated right as he was applying. Now, of course, someone can steal your phone and apply on your behalf. Then we have other measures looking at, behavioral biometrics of how you use your phone. But it's a higher bar than just knowing things about Peter. So I think adding authentication, even though it's not often required by regulators, certainly not part of the CIP practice, but it just adds that additional bar that it makes it difficult and more expensive to fraudsters to get above.
Right, right. So do you think then when you look at the landscape today, and I'm always amazed you hear new breaches happen pretty regularly, and
Yeah.
should the average consumer should assume right now that all of their PII is out there, right? And so where does that leave? What's the purpose of a centralized database? I mean, they seem like they're a 20th century concept that should be done away with.
we are definitely going through a transition where consumers are inundated with breach alerts and letters in the mail and every other story in the news about their identity and data being available. Lots of sites will show you if your data has been breached. And, I checked mine and I couldn't believe how much of my data was, I knew it was out there, but, seeing it firsthand is quite alarming. So we're in this transition phase of going from the old way to new ways. And it really just is part of the banking system and trust and soundness in the financial system to modernize how we do things. Thankfully, a lot of U.S. banks, a lot of U.S. merchants, the U.S. phone companies treat this very seriously and are taking those steps. Increasingly, it's not enough just to know Peter's information. You have to have some kind of hardware element like a SIM key that has to be present during the transaction. It's a bit like EMV. For a long time, there was resistance on putting chips in credit cards and debit cards. But of course, prior to that, I just had to, if I were a waiter and I got your card to pay for lunch, I could, write down your numbers and buy things with your money. Well, now I have to have your EMV chip. Well, that's a lot harder to do. So I think in the same way, with the advent of AI and how that'll just increase the types of attacks, the cost of the attacks be almost free. This acceleration that will erode trust in the digital economy, and the counter to that is going to be like kind of adding the notion of EMV like techniques to online transactions. I don't think it'll be limited to payments. I think it'll be for any transaction with risk. It could be going on a date. How do you know this person is really who they claim to be? It could be buying a lawnmower for someone. I think these worlds are converging. So fraud and risk mitigation is converging with trust and safety. And I think we're going to have to introduce things like EMB, that kind of concept, to online transactions because it's going to be really hard to tell the good versus the questionable.
Okay. I want to talk about something I saw your company mention a little while back, and it's the idea of embedded authentication. Now, we have embedded finance is very much a big part of the ecosystem today. So maybe you can talk about what is embedded authentication, and maybe you can how it can accelerate digital payments.
Yeah, it's kind of the same topic I just spoke of. Again, if you look at, I think we just take for granted how amazing our phones are, but you could hop on a plane and go to Vietnam right now and buy yourself lunch, and the transaction will go through because the circle of trust around the Visa and MasterCard system. Again, EMV will likely be present, so they know that while Peter doesn't, has never gone to Vietnam, we can trust that he's there because his chip was there. In that same vein, when you call people from around the world, like it's pretty convenient, and yet if you check your phone bill, which most of us don't do, you'll never find something on your bill that you didn't do. Every call or text is something that you did because your SIM card is present, just like an EV chip. So I think what embedded means is exactly that. Like there are ways in which you can authenticate a key that acts as your proxy behind the scenes, just like when you make a phone call. And so we're leveraging that technology in what we do. So for example, you're logging into your bank on your phone. Behind the scenes, Prove can say, hey, this is the phone, this is Peter's phone. This is Peter's SIM card that's logging in, despite the username, password, or if it's a passkey, whatever kind of authentication factors they have. We can give a passive authentication behind the scenes saying this is the right piece of hardware that's coming into the bank. And we can keep track of things like that as you change your phone and change your phone number. People often change their phone number for surprising reasons, sometimes to hide from debt, but we can kind of keep track of those changes so that we can maintain the accuracy of who's authenticating into a bank or merchant.
Okay. So what are you returning back to, like your clients that are using Prove to authenticate? And also this is happening in real time while someone's filling out an application or doing a payment or what have you. Do you send them a score to let them know, like, I'm 99% certain this is Peter, or what are you outputting back to your clients?
It's a great point, Peter. We definitely are coming from a probabilistic world. Most transactions in the current way are adjudicated based on the likelihood of you doing them. So if you do Starbucks every morning, and on your app and Costco on the weekends, those transactions always go through. But then you buy $1,000 of Ethereum on MoonPay, and then the bank is like, wow, he never does that, decline. And so if you go from a probabilistic model to a deterministic one, and you say, well, gee, Peter's not known to do this transaction, but his phone was present, his SIM card was present. And by the way, it's not just the SIM key, it's also things like passkeys. And we have a new key in collaboration with the Tier 1 bank coming out called AirKey. These are all like keys in the way that EMV chips are like keys. And the ability to authenticate that gives you a deterministic answer. Now, of course, if I can say for sure that this is Peter's phone and that's behind this transaction, of course, again, maybe you're not in possession of your phone. So you do have some other probabilistic measures, like it's definitely his key, is behind the transaction, but it looks like we're not confident that he's holding this key at this moment in time. So you have to do a bit of both of what's traditionally called risk-based authentication, that's probabilistic, but combining that with deterministic measures like like in the way that EMV works. So behind the scenes, we give them that essentially, hey, there's enough evidence here that we're confident that this is Peter's phone. And then we say, oh, we have enough evidence that he's not holding it during the transaction. Our role at Prove is to help form the identity policy in such a way that our clients can form their authorization policy. So, for example, like we're confident it's Peter's phone, we're not confident he's holding it. Well, maybe that's okay to check the balance at the bank, but certainly not okay to do, a $50,000 wire. So ultimately, what we want to do is be the best, most accurate platform to identify, to tell you it's Peter or not. But ultimately, it impacts our decisions, our scores, our kind of bits of evidence, depending upon what the client wants. All kind of help to shape their authorization policy.
So we've been talking a lot about the mobile phone. What about the transactions happening on desktop computers? I mean, through a browser, the phone may or may not be present, but I imagine there's a different approach you must take there, right?
Also, great question. I think people are sometimes surprised to know that we operate in every channel, even voice calls. Ultimately, the simple answer is as long as you can make the phone part of the transaction. So again, I could type in my phone number in a laptop browser and then click on the link on this phone, and then authenticates that key that phone has. You'll also see increasingly that the phone, the laptop know each other. As you look at like when you're using services like Apple or Google, it'll often, you'll see the interplay between devices
Right.
that are on common Wi-Fi networks. The ability to cut, you can cut something on your phone and paste it in your laptop now
Right.
with iOS. So I think you'll increasingly see there's more and more things to work with between the different devices in our kind of homes and our lives. But it is the simple answer: just getting the phone involved in the transaction is enough to bring trust to other devices.
Right. Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. I want to switch gears and talk about the bad guys, right? Because, they're much more sophisticated now than they used to be. I mean, they have access to all the latest tools and they're not encumbered by KYC or other regulatory requirements. They really can attack like with a lot more freedom than the good guys can. So what are the implications of, particularly now with the popularity of generative AI and how that's being used in fraud? I mean, how should we think about sophisticated fraud rings today?
All the attacks were toward the U.S. government for the last few years due to COVID funds, because that was the best place to get the most money, whether it were nation states or fraud rings. Now that COVID funds have dried up, kind of it's all back to attacking the banks, the merchants, and traditional folks. And of course, these folks never rest. They have more and more sophisticated ways to attack. One thing we've noticed is in the past, like let's say 5 or 6 years ago, you didn't necessarily need a phone number to create an account. Increasingly, you have to have one. So then the attackers would just use what are called voice over IP lines. So they appear to be, real phones with SIM cards, but they're just virtual phone numbers that happen to be able to transact with an SMS, like respond to an OTP. But you could detect those. There's easy ways for folks like Prove and others to say, hey, this phone number is not an actual mobile phone. It's, a virtual phone or a burner phone of that, something you can detect. And then you just tell the user, hey, can you put in your real phone number? Because maybe they use Google Voice, as part of their daily lives, but yet legitimate. Well, now what we're seeing as now that they're coming back to attack banks and merchants is that they're using eSIMs. So it isn't too hard for an attacker to download 10,000 eSIMs from an MVNO in Europe. These are real SIM cards that will not be, you won't be able to catch them by seeing what kind of line type these phone numbers are. Said another way, increasingly the attackers are making it look like a legitimate consumer. And they may even tenure these phone numbers. So they're real mobile numbers. They tenure them so they have Another telltale sign is that half the 12-year-olds in the US, UK, and many countries have a phone. So if you try to open a bank account and your phone number is 10 days old, while it can happen, it's highly unusual. It should be 3 to 6 years of tenure before you open up a trade line. Now, what folks are doing is creating real mobile numbers through eSIMs, putting bots behind them, and yeah, and tenuring them. And so you have to just constantly keep ahead of these types of attacks. Now, we have clever ways of detecting even those. We can detect at the most basic level if a phone number, SIM card, if it's likely being operated by a human or if it's likely operated by a bot. And that's kind of the first step. Let's just make sure you're interacting with a human before you even get to the KYC CIP stage. And ultimately, it's just about making it more and more expensive for the attackers to do their attacks.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So then, what about deep fakes? And I remember it was actually one of your executives talked on a webinar we did earlier this year, and it was really interesting to me because he basically talked about deep fakes not really being a big issue, which I was very surprised about. He talked about securing the mobile channel, which is kind of, I guess, what you've been saying. So maybe you can just give a little bit more color there, because oftentimes you've got to do a selfie, you've got to turn different ways, and they can have, AI deep fakes doing some of that. Are they a real powerful tool that we should be worried about when it comes to fraud?
Yeah, I don't think it's a great question, Peter. I think the way to look at it is like, I don't think we're going to be able to stop the progress of AI and its ability to do, what AI does. One could argue that this Zoom call is a deep fake because it's not really me speaking and it's not really you, talking back. It's just a bunch of ones and zeros, right?
Right.
I think that if you're on the side of being able to delineate something real versus not real, I think that it's going to get more and more expensive and more difficult to do as time goes on. That to us, the telltale sign is, as you said, securing the channel. So, for example, if all of a sudden our banker at Chase gets an email from our CFO saying, please wire this money for this conference, and then he calls our CFO and says, hey, did you send me this email? Which is what normally happens. You know, like again, that could be a deep fake that answers back, yeah, I sent you that email. Please, please send it along. Ultimately, you have to look at the keys behind the transaction. So, for example, when the banker was calling our CFO, was there a SIM swap on that phone number or that SIM card? Like were you really calling that key? So from the standpoint of like the way EMV works, how do you know that you can authenticate or not authenticate the key behind the person you're interacting with? So it always goes back down to that. There has to be some manipulation of the keys in order for the deepfake to work. And so we're less focused on the thing, in this case, the deepfake, and more focused on the thing that authenticates the thing. So whether it's a deepfake, a payment, a Tinder date, hailing a ride, it's all about the keys that are behind the transaction, authenticating them. And I think that gets you, it's still a very hard problem to solve. There's lots of ways to manipulate SIM cards and passkeys and the keys I speak of. But that's what we're at Prove developing expertise in. We call that future key management. So as people move away from one-time passcodes, from KBA, from usernames and passwords, ultimately it's key management. It's managing the keys that are representatives in a digital world that we can authenticate. So key management is kind of the answer to how you authenticate things, regardless of what the thing itself is, whether it's a deep fake or anything else.
Right. So when you're interacting online, I'm curious, every time you do a transaction, every time you log in, there's often one-time passcodes that have to get entered in, sending to your phone. I mean, are there things that when you're interacting online, you go, oh, this is bad. I don't want to interact with this website. I mean, is there sort of some basic telltale signs maybe that they're fake?
Yeah, I wish there were an easy way, especially with like, folks like our parents that are, even more susceptible to all sorts of scams. It's really hard. Which is why I think people go to places like Amazon where they can, they may even be paying more, but they trust the brand, they trust the channel, they trust their interactions there. I think that it's obviously it's helpful when the bank covers your loss. I don't think there is an easy way to tell. I see more and more examples of people that even brands that they trust are, there's people that are posing as those brands,
Right.
especially in social media. You can create a channel on TikTok and say you're Bank of America.
Right.
Now, what you're going to start seeing, something that Prove is really trying to pioneer is visual cues. So, for example, like you'll see the early versions of this, like whether someone's verified on X or platforms like that. And so, sometimes it starts with celebrities and VIPs. I think we'll move into the world that you're going to have to look for visual cues that is the counterparty, whether it's a merchant, a person, a Tinder date, or whatever it may be. Have they been verified? And I think that's the world we're going to move into. I think there's going to be a need to balance anonymity with accountability.
Right.
So, for example, if I want to buy someone's used lawnmower on a marketplace and it's lawnmower guy 5,000. Look, I can respect that he doesn't want to share or she doesn't want to share the real name, but imagine a visual cue that gives me the confidence that if this person does do something that breaks the law or breaks the term of service, you can kind of break the glass and see who they really are.
Right.
I think we're going to have to move into an environment where if you're sending someone money through a P2P scheme or whatever it is, again, like I think that you're going to start seeing visual cues to give you trust in the transaction. It's something that Prove is we're really excited about some of the announcements we'll make on visual cues that consumers, marketplaces can use to give folks confidence to do the transaction itself.
That's super interesting. Interesting. So, when you're looking across banking and fintech, what are the popular attack vectors today for criminals? Is it primarily during onboarding, or is there something else that is popular?
It's really all the above. It comes down to more and more sophisticated ways to pose as someone else. That could be an account takeover. It could be an onboarding event. I'm actually the one. I may give a slight preference to account takeover because there's more things available. So, for example, if I pretend to be Peter to open an account, I may have a small line. Maybe it's $1,000 at first. If I can take over Peter's account, you may have a $10,000 line. So I think that and I'm just speaking anecdotally, more and more kind of examples where people pose as others for existing accounts. It could be something as simple as like, "Hey, I'm Peter. I changed my number." We're seeing 10 million phone numbers get permanently disconnected in the U.S. every month.
Wow.
Now, some of that is the phone number in your Apple Watch that you didn't know you even had before you deactivated it. But it could be a big percentage of that are people that are hiding maybe from debt, and then those phone numbers get recycled. The 12-year-olds get their first phone. All that noise means it's not unusual for you to call a bank, a merchant. Oh, it's Peter. I've changed my number. My ex was harassing me, whatever it may be. But it's not you. It's someone posing as you. And I think that's why it goes back to key management. How do you make sure that if you're authenticating against SIM cards, pass keys, all sorts of keys, how do you manage changes to those as people change their phone numbers legitimately, as people get new phones every couple of years, as you may have more than one phone in your household. Like I have a work phone and a personal phone. Sometimes I use my wife's phone. Ultimately, that's where kind of the investment in managing keys and how they tie out to identities and act as our proxies. I think that's the vital for the road ahead. But yeah, it's all the above, maybe a slight preference toward account takeover.
Interesting. Okay, so last question then. When you're looking at the anti-fraud, verification, authentication landscape, and then you look at the fraudsters, who's winning, I guess is what I really want to know. Right now, do you feel like the fraudsters have the upper hand? Is the technology such that what you've talked about in this interview, that we're really catching the majority of the fraud? What are your thoughts there?
We obviously don't know all things that are happening that get caught before that happens or just haven't been announced. I think some of the scale of the breaches are just getting to be larger and larger, like numbing how large they are. And there's probably many that have taken place that we're not even aware of. And so I have to think that in an environment where there's two wars going on and you need plenty of money to fund wars, it'll find a way. And I think I've definitely put it out that the fraudsters, the attackers, the money launderers are winning. The places that you should see the sanctions working as an international community don't seem to be working as well as they should be, which means the money is getting there. And so I just from that alone, I think they're winning.
It means that companies like you are needed more than ever, and you've probably I always say that everyone in this space, it feels like it's such a It changes so fast. It's so important. We're going to need companies like yours in 1,000 years' time, right? When it's still going to be fraudsters trying to do battle and people trying to stop them. So anyway, Rodger, really, really appreciate you coming on the show today. I learned a lot. It was a fascinating conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Peter.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you so much for listening. Please go ahead and give the show a review on the podcast platform of your choice and go tell your friends and colleagues about it. Anyway, on that note, I will sign off. I very much appreciate you listening, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.